Yosemite National Park is a vast area of mountain paths, alpine wilderness, and redwood forests, one of the most beautiful scenic attractions in America. Set aside in 1890 to preserve a portion of the natural beauty of the Sierra Nevadas in California, its breathtaking topography rises as high as 13,000 feet above sea level. 200 miles of winding road and 840 miles of foot trails have lured tourists, campers, and skiers for decades. But under the mosaic of green conifer pines, domes of granite rock, silvery waterfalls, and misty mountain sky, a killer lurked. His first victims were a 43-year-old woman and 2 teenagers. They were missing for more than a month, and when the FBI located their bodies, a cry of serial killer shook the peaceful tranquility of God's country. The saga began on February 12, 1999, when Carole Sund, her daughter Juli, 15, and 16-year-old Silvina Pelosso left the Sund home in Eureka, California, and started on a vacation to where the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains melt into Yosemite. After first flying to San Francisco, where Mrs. Sund rented a red 1999 Pontiac Grand Prix, they paused in Stockton, where Juli took part in a cheerleading contest at the University of the Pacific. Then they headed out for Cedar Lodge in El Portal, which is located on Yosemite's western slope. There, a room for 3 was reserved. They arrived at the inn early on the 14th. Mrs. Sund and her husband, Jens, 43, both prominent realtors in the Stockton area, had been entertaining the Pelosso girl for several weeks. A foreign exchange student from Argentina and a friend of Juli's, she was spending 3 months with a family that had already shown her the Bay Area and Disneyland. Jens couldn't accompany them on this trip because he needed to prepare for an upcoming business trip. On February the 15th, the ladies hiked and took in the wonders of the park. According to the FBI, witnesses later reported seeing the trio inspecting the giant sequoia trees in nearby Tuolumne Grove. That evening, by reports, the mother and the teens rented a couple of videos from the lodge's service desk to watch in their room. None of them were seen alive again. The inn staff claimed that when they cleaned the room the next morning, February the 16th, they had detected no evidence of foul play. Checkout had been done in advance, and the keys were left on the room desk, as was customary. Jens Sund had scheduled to meet them at the San Francisco airport that evening on his way to Arizona, to where the others were to accompany him. While he attended his meeting, the females were to tour the Grand Canyon. Jens did not find his wife at the airport and assumed she had flown ahead, writes columnist Robert F. Howe in Time magazine. She was not in Phoenix either, but he played a round of golf there the next day, and when she had still not attempted to contact him, he called the police. Evidently, it seemed that the ladies had never returned the rented Pontiac, nor notify an anxious rental agency that they were extending their agreement. Local police and Yosemite security began to search the area where the missing 3 were last seen. The initial suspicion was that they may have wandered off the main hiking paths and got lost in the maze of confusing woodland. But soon, that assumption dwindled. For 4 weeks, police, family, and volunteers combed the rugged terrain of the Sierra Nevada mountains in and near Yosemite National Park by helicopter, foot, and skis. They were looking for a missing red 1999 Pontiac Grand Prix and the women who rented it. But when days passed and, strangely, Carole's wallet showed up on a Modesto, California street, its money and contents intact, the FBI smelled something bigger. At this point, we've not yet uncovered evidence to allow us to determine conclusively whether this was a tragic accident or a criminal act, said FBI agent Nick Rossi on February 26th. But 2 weeks later, FBI predictions darkened. After a massive search and rescue team working around the clock in a 30-mile radius failed to find anyone, Agent James Maddock, now placed in charge of the investigation, told the press, "We feel almost certain that the women were victims of a violent crime." Because of the discovery of Sund's wallet in suburban Modesto, police and FBI canvassed, to quote Maddock, the logical routes in and out of that spot, interviewing homeowners and business owners and others who may have seen them. The Bureau relocated its headquarters from Yosemite to Modesto at this point, and, on February 28th, 12 days after the women's disappearance, hinted that it was no longer treating the Sund incident as a missing persons case, but as a murder. More than 1,000 leads, they confessed, produced nothing. Still, the Bureau intensified its search, recruiting the use of more high-tech equipment and air support. As the last days of February stumbled into March, the public still hoped. In Modesto, a march and vigil were held for the missing persons. Unofficially, Juli Sund offered a $250,000 reward for information that would lead to the return of the missing women. After a couple of weeks, he upped the sum to $300,000, but to no avail. Mrs. Sund's parents, Francis and Carole Carrington, appeared on television's Good Morning America to entreat the prayers of Americans and their help in locating their daughter and the children. In nowhere else were expectations higher than among the other Sund children, who believed their mother and sister Juli would be returned. By the middle of March, however, even their anticipations sagged. Her mother, sister, and a family friend had been missing for a month by the time Juli Sund read her poem in front of 1,000 or so people who gathered in Modesto. "Deep in my heart, I know something my mind does not want to learn," said Gina, 13. "I try to stay strong because I know that's what you'd want your baby to be. But, Mummy, I don't want you to leave me." Then came hard reality. The Sund family's worst fears were confirmed when a hiker wandered onto the site of a burned-out red 1999 Pontiac hidden off Highway 108 in the Stanislaus Forest region late in the day on March 18th. The California Highway Patrol verified the car's license plate as Mrs. Sund's rented vehicle and immediately notified the FBI. Agents arrived at the scene early on the 19th. Opening the trunk, investigators found 2 charred bodies. The corpses were unrecognizable, but within days were identified as Carole Sund and Silvina Pelosso. Authorities now suspected that young Juli may have met with a similar fate elsewhere. Canvassing the vicinity, FBI agents spread out along Highway 108, questioning locals and stopping cars for any information that might tell them how and when the car got there, but more importantly, to find Juli. But it was near Lake Pedro in Tuolumne County, miles away, that the badly decomposed body of Juli Sund was at last found on March 25th. The girl's throat had been cut. Throughout the next several weeks, a task force, comprised of FBI agents and law enforcers from 4 surrounding counties, dedicated to no other purpose than to round up suspects, arrested several known sex offenders, drug users, and ex-convicts with a record of violence from within a 75-square-mile area between Modesto and Sonoma. The police figured that the killer of the 3 women was someone familiar with the county, for whoever was guilty had successfully maneuvered an otherwise obvious shiny red Pontiac unseen through the natural terrain of ravines, lakes, dense woods, and country roads. More so, opined the FBI, only a native would have been aware of the out-of-the-way site where the car, with its grisly contents, was eventually abandoned. The FBI believed that the killer knew the area of abandoned gold mines well enough to hide the car off a spur road where locals dump old refrigerators, cars, and washing machines, and well enough to know that the smell of a burning car would likely not attract attention because the air often reeks from people burning their garbage. Unsettled locals were starting to whisper about possible murderers in their midst. By mid-April, those who had been apprehended on suspicion were ordered to testify in front of a grand jury in Fresno, California. A few weeks later, James Maddock, in charge of the FBI manhunt, confirmed what the news media outlets already were reporting, that the key players in the sightseer slayings had been arrested and were in jail on related charges. Although not named in print at the time, these names have since been published by the Fresno Bee. Michael Mick Larwick, 42, of Modesto, part of a vagabond group of methamphetamine drug users and friends centered in the Modesto area. Larwick, who grew up in Tuolumne County, near where the bodies of Carole Sund and Silvina Pelosso were found, was jailed March 16th after he allegedly shot a Modesto police officer, an event that was ensued by a 14-hour standoff. He had a long criminal record and has been questioned extensively by the FBI. He denies any role in the Yosemite slayings. Eugene Rufus Dykes, 32, also of Modesto, and Larwick's half-brother. Arrested in March, he was serving a year at Jewel Institution for an unrelated parole violation and had a long criminal record including sex and weapons convictions. In an interview from Jewel in June, he denied any involvement in the murders. Billy Joe Strange, 39, an El Portal parolee who worked at the Cedar Lodge Lounge and Restaurant where the murdered women were last seen. He was arrested on March 5th when he allegedly reported to his parole officer with liquor on his breath. The FBI pushed for Strange's arrest, but he denied any part in the triple murders. Reportedly, many friends have rushed forward to his aid, calling the FBI's suspicion a travesty. Daryl Gray Stevens, 55, Strange's roommate. Convicted in 1978 for rape and robbery, he was jailed on March 14th for failing to register as a sex offender. Stevens told the Bee that he is innocent. When the four men listed previously were considered the main murder suspects in the initial inquiries, others have since been questioned by the FBI. These people, who were never regarded as the possible killers, were nonetheless dragged into the case as perhaps abettors or witnesses. Rachel Lou Campbell, 36, of Modesto, who was charged in April with stealing checks and credit cards and converting them into cash and merchandise worth $365,000. Campbell, who pleaded innocent to that charge, reportedly was a key witness. When first arrested on mail fraud charges, she had in her possession Carole Sund's checking account and automated teller machine numbers. Larry Dwayne Utley, 41, an associate of Dykes and Larwick, first picked up during a March parole sweep. He was arrested in May on an unrelated criminal charge, but was soon released. Teresa K. Gray, 36, of Modesto. The FBI task force investigating Yosemite issued a federal warrant for her arrest after she failed to appear in Stanislaus County Drug Court in June. Kenneth Soldier Stewart, 24, a former cellmate of Dykes, who was charged with attempted murder. He had been questioned about any involvement. Angelia Dale, who testified before the federal grand jury. She was subpoenaed because she's a friend of Dykes and Larwick. Maria Ledbetter, 24, of Modesto, an admitted methamphetamine addict and former girlfriend of Dykes, about whom she was questioned extensively. Jeffrey Wayne Keeney, 32, of Modesto, arrested on an unrelated drug charge. He had been questioned about the Yosemite case. By the end of June, the FBI had reviewed the testimonies and the evidence linked to the suspects in custody. At that time, the Bureau stated that, while no one had yet been charged, it felt that those responsible for killing the three women at Yosemite were already behind bars. The nation breathed a sigh of relief. Others, too, had been questioned in the slayings, more routine than anything, and released. One of these was a man named Cary Stayner, clean-cut, with no record of violence, and was in the employment of Cedar Lodge as its handyman. 3 weeks after the FBI made its statement above, the case was reopened. And the nation grimaced. A fourth victim was brutally slain just a few miles from Cedar Lodge. Acting on a tip from a caller who was worried about the whereabouts of his friend, Joie Ruth Armstrong, park rangers found her mutilated body on the morning of July 22nd. It was discovered beyond a campground adjacent to her living quarters in the Foresta community, an enclave of some 30 cabins for use by park workers. 26-year-old Joie had been employed by the Yosemite Institute. Station KCRA-TV in Sacramento, citing an unidentified source, was the first to leak the terrible news that the girl was decapitated. She had probably been murdered on the evening of Wednesday, July 21st, investigators determined. In fact, she had been seen that day at the Institute offices, near where Carole Sund and the teenagers were found earlier in the year. Miss Armstrong was probably only hours away from leaving her quarters to visit a friend in Sausalito, California. When she did not appear as planned, her would-be host had phoned the park. Police found her car in front of her cabin, packed for the trip. In light of its earlier estimation that the case was closed, the FBI remained relatively quiet but conceded that the case needed to be re-evaluated. Chief James Maddock said he himself questioned whether the Bureau could have done anything to prevent Armstrong's killing. "I've struggled with that issue for the last 24 hours and continue to do so," he confessed. He did feel, however, that the FBI spared nothing to investigate the earlier killings. "I'm confident we've done everything that could be reasonably done." The Armstrong tragedy reawakened dark fears and brought back those bad dreams the local residents thought they could put behind them. By Friday, the day after she was found dead, a hush had fallen over Yosemite Park. Freckled, red-haired, and full of energy and enthusiasm, Armstrong loved children, nature, and teaching. Those loves took her to Yosemite, a place known for its peace and beauty, wrote the Modesta Bee, one of a line of community bee newspapers throughout California. Written the weekend after Armstrong was slain, it went on. For the past year, she had worked for the Yosemite Institute, a nonprofit group that runs education programs through a partnership with the National Park Service. Joie was a bright light to all who knew her, said Mike Lee, the Yosemite Institute's director. We'll remember her as so full of laughter and love, and as a committed and gifted teacher. Authorities went to the meadow Armstrong loved on Thursday, not long after she was reported missing, and found her body next to a stream she and her friends used for drinking water. You should come see this place. I wonder if you ever will, Armstrong had emailed her friend only days earlier. I love my garden and living in Yosemite, one of the most beautiful places in the whole world. On Saturday, July 24th, within 48 hours of the Armstrong killing, FBI agents and in-charge James Maddock announced at a press conference that a man was in custody on strong suspicion of murder and that a significant announcement would be made shortly. The suspect, Cary Stayner, 37, had been one of the people questioned about the triple killings in February. But, at that time, no evidence linked itself to Stayner, and he had been released. Because he was the handyman at the Cedar Lodge in El Portal where Carole Sund and her 2 charges had stayed before they were murdered, his questioning at that time seemed to have been more routine than anything. But now, after another ghastly murder, he was again led in for questioning, immediately after the body of Miss Armstrong was found. This time, agents detained him and forced him to answer more questions. Investigators searched his truck and confiscated his backpack for examination. Upon release, the FBI warned him not to leave El Portal, as they probably were not through with him. According to the San Francisco Chronicle, a witness claimed that Stayner was angry about authorities seizing his backpack after he was questioned earlier that day. He was also angry about how his truck had been searched. Evidently, the agents also searched Stayner's apartment later in the day and discovered evidence that they determined linked him to Armstrong's murder. And they found even more. Special Agent Maddock explained, during the last 24 hours, we've developed specific information linking Stayner also to the Sund Pelosso murders. What this evidence was not made known, but he did indicate it was discovered in the search of Stayner's apartment over Cedar Lodge. Stayner, in the meantime, had disappeared from the locale and was gone from the premises by the time agents came to arrest him. This was Friday evening, July 23rd. However, they caught up with him at the Laguna del Sol nudist colony, where he was known to frequent. Its manager had seen a newscast on television, recognized Stayner's photo as one of his guests, and notified the FBI. Agents returned him to El Portal on Saturday, where he was put through a lengthy interrogation. By evening's end, the FBI felt it had gathered enough evidence and damaging testimony to arrest Cary Stayner for murder. Sunday morning, they rushed him to Fresno to officially lodge a complaint, then to Sacramento on Monday, where he was arraigned before the courts. That same day, Stayner allowed himself to be interviewed by a reporter from KNTV. During the session, an unexpected event occurred. In a voice that seemed relieved to be unburdened from a deep, long-kept secret, Stayner blurted, "I'm guilty. I did murder Carole Sund, Juli Sund, Silvina Pelosso, and Joie Armstrong." His confession and the details that followed shocked America. In the interview, Stayner said he had fantasized about killing women for the last 30 years and described in detail how he murdered Carole Sund, her daughter Juli, and visiting Argentine student Pelosso. He'd strangled Pelosso and Carole Sund in their rented cabin in the Cedar Lodge Motel, then took Juli Sund to a lake where he killed her early the next morning. He abandoned the group's rental car with the bodies of Mrs. Sund and Silvina inside, returning 2 days later to burn the evidence and to retrieve Mrs. Sund's wallet, which he dumped in Modesto to confuse authorities. Stayner said he thought he had gotten away with the earlier crimes, but could not resist the urge to kill Armstrong after he struck up a chance conversation with her. Concluding the interview, he addressed the victims' families. "I'm sorry their loved ones were where they were when they were. I wish I could have controlled myself and not done what I did." FBI sources claim that he had already confessed his guilt during the Saturday evening interrogation. In the Bureau's mind, this time it had the right man. he had given the FBI details only the killer would know in such specificity that agents were able to recover evidence confirming his confession. Knives were used in the slayings, and the weapon suspected in Ms. Armstrong's death was recovered. Billed as Mr. Nice Guy. He would have been the farthest of suspects in the locals' minds. If that comment made by Cedar Lodge restaurant manager Kathy Hefner sounds unforgivably naive, there's more to come. Most of Stayner's co-workers would probably say they fully understand why he had fooled the FBI as long as he did. He just wasn't the killer type, not a troublemaker, not a wise guy, never violent. His only encounter with the law was for marijuana use in 1997. The relatively quiet but friendly motel handyman's only passions seemed to be nude sunbathing and hiking. On days off, he would escape to Laguna del Sol, a nudist colony in Sacramento County. Despite this sensual surrender, he never behaved lewdly nor perversely. Stayner's father, Delbert, admits that he thinks his son Cary may have suffered a trauma at age 11 when his younger brother Steven, then 7, was abducted in 1972, disappearing for 8 years. At that time, Steven had been forced to endure molestations by his kidnapper, whom he finally turned in to the police. The real-life drama was later turned into a television movie. But, says Delbert, puberty-aged Cary endured some emotional hardships because of that incident. After graduation from Merced, California High School, Stayner worked as a window installer at a glass company. The Cedar Lodge hired him as a handyman in 1997 and gave him the use of a small apartment on the top floor. Management found him a hard worker and honest. In his capacity, Stayner performed technical and housekeeping duties, everything from fixing electrical and mechanical breakdowns to delivering extra towels and bedding to guests. He usually ate lunch and dinner at the motel restaurant, and often after work would relax with one beer and a bowl of soup. Some who knew Cary have an incredibly difficult time accepting the facts. Sandy Cox, whose husband owned the window company where Stayner worked for in Atwater, says, "We've known Cary since he was a little boy. It just doesn't match up. Out of respect for his family and the victim's family, we don't want to say anything else." When questioned further by the press about the FBI's error in not identifying Stayner as a suspect earlier, as well as what finally led them to Stayner, Maddock replied, "I do look forward to the day I can share the details of the investigations from start to finish." However, that answer was not good enough for many, including 2 attorneys representing some of the previously mentioned 4 men behind bars who were still considered suspects in the Yosemite killings. Some of these suspects had already passed lie detector tests, said their lawyers, and have even offered to give blood samples to support their innocence. One suspect had conclusive proof he had been working out of state at the time of the killings, but remained under scrutiny just the same. And meanwhile, their perturbed lawyers saw their clients as patsies forced to wait on the sidelines while the FBI struggled to make up its own mind. "I don't understand how such a large investigation with such experienced investigators missed the trail completely," says Ramon Magana, representing 2 of the women. "They put so much time, energy, and resources into an investigation of people that appear to be unrelated and unconnected to the case." A brother in cause to Magana is Stanislaus County Public Defender Tim Bazar, who claims, "I've never heard any evidence that ties anyone to these slayings. Not only did the FBI arrest everyone, over the last several months they attempted to put pressure on one or the other to turn the others in the group in. It actually appears they had nothing against anybody." None of these voices is more intriguing, however, than that of Mrs. Raquel Pelosso, whose daughter Silvina perished in Yosemite. "I just cannot understand how so many people didn't realize that maybe Stayner was the man, since I heard that he was interviewed some time ago." In defense of the FBI's hesitancy to speak and commit, they and many others cannot believe that Stayner acted by himself. In the meantime, a grand jury continued to look into whether or not others were involved, including the previously listed suspects. "No one's off the hook yet," an unidentified source had told the San Francisco Chronicle. Quoted the Modesto Bee, "In El Portal, a number of residents are convinced that no one person could have created so much horror, especially in the Sund and Pelosso slayings. The logistics of it say it had to involve more than one person," said Letty Carolyn Berry, owner of the Yosemite Rosebud Lodge, west of the Cedar Lodge. Privately, some members of the Sund Pelosso task force are saying the same thing, sources have told the Bee. These sources say it's difficult for some investigators to believe Stayner could have gotten the jump on all three women without any help, let alone dispose their bodies. And on the flip side, the same paper notes another unconfirmed source that maintains Stayner did act alone, with the help of only a weapon. Stayner, says the source, used a gun after gaining entry to the motel room of the Sunds in Pelosso and tied them up. The death penalty trial of Cary Stayner was moved from Mariposa County to Santa Clara County, California. In May 2002, Stayner pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity to the 1999 murders of 3 tourists in Yosemite National Park. In mid-July of 2002, the trial began in Judge Thomas C. Hastings' courtroom with the prosecution team headed by George Williamson and the defense team headed by Marcia Morrissey. On Monday, July 22nd, the court heard the former motel handyman's taped confession, which he had given to FBI agents. According to Fresno Bee reporter Cindy Fontana, in the taped confession, Stayner calmly reviewed how he'd strangled 16-year-old Silvina Pelosso in a motel bathtub near Yosemite National Park, how he assaulted Juli Sund, 15, for hours before spiriting her away from the motel room she shared with her mother, 42-year-old Carole Sund, and friend Silvina. And then, not as calmly, how he carried Juli, kinda like a groom carrying a bride over the threshold, to a lonely vista point near Lake Don Pedro, pledged his love, and then cut her throat as the sun lightened the sky. Stayner's confession to the strangulation murder of Carole Sund had been played to the court the previous week. The issue was no longer who committed the murders, but whether Stayner was insane at the time and whether the confession to the FBI agents was coerced. Stayner is serving a life sentence for the Yosemite Park murder of Joie Ruth Armstrong. The issue of whether Stayner's confession was coerced seemed to be resolved when on July 24th, the court heard the recorded demands that Stayner made to the FBI agents that he wanted satisfied before he would give them his confession. Stayner demanded that his parents be given the reward money, that he be incarcerated at a prison near his parents' home, and, to Stayner's detriment, that he be given a large cache of pornography. Previously, the defense had maintained that the FBI had coerced Stayner's confession. In the end, Stayner confessed without the promise of pornography or reward money for his parents. After days of hearing the prosecution characterize Stayner, 41, as a cunning, cold-blooded killer, Judge Thomas C. Hastings' court was presented with the defense testimony regarding Stayner's state of mind when he committed the murders. First, the defense called Dr. Jose Arturo Silva, whose testimony the Fresno Bee's Cindy Fontana described thusly. In the constellation of mental illness, Cary Stayner alone apparently could fill the sky. His enduring preoccupation with the creature Bigfoot, the prophecies of Nostradamus, the nightmares of disembodied heads, the lack of empathy towards others, the obsessive hair-pulling, and more. A stew of disorders such as voyeurism, social dysfunction, violent fantasies, mild autism, and even a family tree laden with sexual abuse and mental illness. For the next 2 weeks, the court heard a group of experts testifying to Stayner's lack of criminal culpability due to brain abnormalities and mental illness. In mid-August, 2 experts debated the photos of Stayner's brain and sharply disagreed. Dr. Joseph Wu, an expert called by the defense, saw abnormalities that could account for Stayner's violent tendencies, whereas Dr. Alan Waxman, called by the prosecution, saw nothing special to explain Stayner's behavior. Ultimately, the closing arguments would present 2 very different views of Cary Stayner, a cold-blooded murdering sexual predator and a mentally ill victim of child abuse who was overcome by his disabilities. Morrissey, referring to the testimony of the defense medical experts made on August 21, 2002, claimed that Stayner was a long way from being the organized, sophisticated serial predator that the prosecution suggested. As reported by Court TV and Associated Press, in his rebuttal of the defense's closing arguments on Thursday, August 23, 2002, prosecutor George Williamson said there was overwhelming evidence to convict Cary Stayner of first-degree murder and 6 special circumstances that could trigger the death penalty. Williamson said defense lawyer Marcia Morrissey had to blow smoke because she didn't have facts or the law to support her claims that Stayner was too crazy to have the intent to kill required for first-degree murder. Monday, August 26, 2002, The jury in the Stayner case took less than 5 hours to find him guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder, for which he may face the death penalty. He stood emotionless as he was convicted of the murders of Carole and Juli Sund and Silvina Pelosso. While there were weeks of testimony during the final phase of the trial regarding Stayner's sanity, the second phase of the trial required that the prosecution prove that Stayner was sane, and the third phase of the trial would determine his ultimate punishment. The defense team lost its bid to prevent Dr. Park Dietz from testifying for the prosecution. Dr. Dietz is a well-known forensic psychiatrist who's testified in a number of major cases, including the Andrea Yates case. Winning a case with an insanity plea is usually quite difficult. The defense called Dr. Allison McInnes, assistant professor of psychiatry and human genetics at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York. Dr. McInnes addressed the issue of Cary Stayner's bad genes, which was described by Fresno Bee reporter Cindy Fontana. The story of Cary Stayner's family tree rose in bursts of bright color from a white horizontal chart: yellow for psychosis, green for obsessive-compulsive disorder, red for substance abuse, even more colors for more mental diseases ranging through 4 generations down to Stayner himself, the fruit of a family gene pool marked by psychiatric disorders. It was Dr. McInnes's belief that Stayner was legally insane when he committed the murders of the 4 women in Yosemite. Prosecutor George Williamson lost no time in challenging the credentials of Dr. McInnes in a rigorous cross-examination. Didn't Stayner know that he was killing human beings? Didn't he understand that his crimes were legally wrong? Dr. McInnes answered in the affirmative. Dr. Park Dietz made a very strong showing. He knew what he was doing was wrong, Dr. Dietz said emphatically. In his extensive testimony, he pointed out that the murders were planned, carried out with deception, covered up, and lied about. Dietz called Stayner one of the higher functioning criminals he had encountered. On Monday, September 16, 2002, the jury determined that Stayner was sane at the time of the murders. This decision took the jury less than 4 hours to make. CNN reported on October 9, 2002, the jury recommended that Cary Stayner should die for killing 3 Yosemite National Park tourists in 1999, rejecting defense pleas to spare a mentally ill man twisted by genetics and childhood trauma. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jurors rejected the option of recommending life in prison. Sentencing was scheduled for December 12th. The courtroom was silent after the decision was read. Stayner showed no visible reaction. In 2002, during the penalty phase of his trial, Stayner was sentenced to death and thereafter entered housing in the Adjustment Center on death row at San Quentin Penitentiary in California. Stayner remains on death row, though there have been no executions in California since a 2006 court ruling over flaws discovered in the administration of capital punishment in the state.